Elena Mitchell owned the building. Not rented, not leased, not borrowed from some distant landlord who had never set foot in the neighborhood and wouldn't recognize the place if he saw it. Owned outright, free and clear, the deed signed by her grandmother 50 years ago, when Brooklyn was still a place where working families could put down roots and watch them grow into something that meant home. The bakery on the first floor had been called Mitchell's since 1952, when Elena's grandmother had arrived from Sicily with nothing but a suitcase full of recipes and the stubborn conviction that good bread could make any neighborhood better. 3 generations of Mitchell women had stood behind that counter, kneading dough before dawn and serving customers who became friends, who became family, in the way that only happens in places where people actually see each other. The shop had survived 3 recessions, 2 mayors who tried to rezone the neighborhood into something more profitable, a fire in 1987 that took out the back wall but somehow spared the ovens, and the slow gentrification that had transformed the blocks around it into unrecognizable territory of coffee shops and boutiques that charged $15 for a sandwich. Elena had survived all of that. She had buried her husband 12 years ago, raised 3 sons who had all made it to adulthood without prison records or drug habits, and kept the bakery running through every storm that the city had thrown at her. She would survive this too, whatever this turned out to be. The young man standing at her counter that Tuesday morning in October did not look like he needed surviving. He looked like he needed feeding, which was a different problem entirely, and one that Elena was better equipped to solve. He was 20 years old, maybe younger, though the hollowness in his cheeks made it hard to tell. His clothes hung loose on a frame that should have been broader, the way clothes hang on people who have lost weight they couldn't afford to lose. His hair was dark and unwashed, pushed back from a face that would have been handsome if it hadn't been so gaunt. But it was his eyes that caught Elena's attention and held it. Dark eyes, almost black in the morning light filtering through the bakery's front window. Watchful eyes that tracked every movement in the room, every customer who came and went, every creak of the floorboards and jingle of the bell above the door. Eyes that carried a weight that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with having seen too much too young. Elena had been seeing eyes like that for 30 years in this neighborhood. She knew what they meant. She knew the stories they told even when their owners never spoke a word. She knew without being told that this young man was running from something. And she knew from 3 decades of experience with boys who were running that the worst thing she could do was ask about it. "You want coffee?" she asked, keeping her voice casual, already reaching for a cup before he could answer. The young man hesitated. His hand went to his pocket, a reflexive motion that stopped halfway through when he remembered what was not there. "I do not have money." His voice was flat, defensive, the words delivered like a confession that expected punishment. Elena poured the coffee and set it on the counter. "Did I ask for money?" He stared at her and she saw something flicker in those dark eyes, something that might have been confusion or suspicion or both. "No? Then drink your coffee." She turned to the display case where the morning pastries were arranged in neat rows, the product of 4 hours of work that had begun at 3 in the morning when the rest of Brooklyn was still sleeping. She selected a croissant, still warm, the layers golden and flaky, a Danish filled with the cherry preserves she made every summer from fruit bought at the farmer's market, and a thick slice of the olive bread she had pulled from the oven an hour ago, the crust crackling and the inside soft with pockets of oil and salt. All of it went onto a plate that she slid across the counter toward him. "Eat." He stared at the food like it might bite him. "Why?" Elena planted her hands on her hips and fixed him with the look she had perfected, raising 3 sons, all of whom had turned out reasonably decent despite their best efforts to the contrary. It was the look that said she was not asking, and she was not negotiating, and she was not going to repeat herself. "Because you are hungry. Because I have more than I need. Because my grandmother did not survive the Depression by turning away people who needed help. Because my mother did not raise me to watch a young person starve when I have bread going stale in my display case." She gestured at the plate. "You want more reasons or you want to eat?" The young man's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Closer than anything else she had seen on his face since he walked through the door. He ate. Elena went back to her work, wiping down counters that were already clean, rearranging pastries that didn't need rearranging, giving him the space to eat without feeling watched. She had learned that too over the years. Hungry people ate better when they didn't feel observed. He finished everything on the plate. The croissant first, torn into pieces and consumed with a focus that suggested he hadn't eaten in days. Then the Danish, more slowly, savoring the sweetness. Finally the olive bread, which he ate with his eyes half closed, and Elena felt a small spark of pride because that bread was her grandmother's recipe, and it was still the best thing she made. When the plate was empty, he looked up at her. "Thank you." The words came out rough, like they had been stored somewhere dusty and forgotten. Elena nodded. "You are welcome. Come back tomorrow if you are still hungry." She turned away before he could respond, disappearing into the back kitchen where the ovens were already warming for the afternoon batch. She heard the bell above the door jingle as he left, and she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. One meal. It wasn't much. But it was something. And sometimes something was the whole difference. The young man came back the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. He never asked for food. He just appeared at the counter around closing time when the bakery was quiet and the last customers had gone home with their purchases, and he stood there with those watchful eyes until Elena noticed him. She always noticed him. She fed him without comment, without questions, without any expectation of explanation or gratitude. Just bread and coffee and whatever pastries were left from the day's inventory, offered with the same matter-of-fact kindness that her grandmother had shown to countless hungry strangers during the hard years when Brooklyn was full of them. On the third day, he told her his name. Alessandro. Elena was sweeping the front step when he said it, the broom making soft scratching sounds against the concrete as she worked. She didn't stop sweeping. Alessandro, Italian. My mother was Italian. His voice was quiet. The words weighted with something she couldn't quite identify. My father was nobody worth mentioning. Elena kept sweeping. Where are you sleeping? Alessandro's shoulders stiffened, a defensive reflex she recognized from her youngest son, the one who had spent 2 years on the streets before finally getting himself together and going back to school. Around. Around is not an answer. Around is the only answer I have. Elena finished sweeping and leaned the broom against the wall. She turned to study the young man, taking in the details she had not noticed before. The scar above his left eyebrow, thin and white, the kind that came from a blade rather than an accident. The careful way he positioned himself to watch every angle of the street, never putting his back to an open space. The tension that never quite left his body, even when he was eating, even when he was safe. He was not just hungry. He was not just homeless. He was running from something specific, something dangerous, something that had taught him to watch his surroundings like a predator or prey. Maybe both. I have a storage room in the back, Elena said. It has a cot. The last tenant left it behind when he moved out. Not much, but it is warm and it locks from the inside. Alessandro's eyes narrowed. Why would you offer that? Because you need it. That is not how the world works. Elena picked up her broom and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her. The bell jingled, a soft, familiar sound that had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. Maybe, but it is how my bakery works. You coming or not? She didn't look back. She didn't need to. After a long moment, she heard his footsteps on the floor behind her. He followed her inside. The storage room was exactly what Elena had described. Small, windowless, filled with the smell of flour and yeast that permeated everything in the bakery. The cot against the back wall was narrow and creaky, covered with blankets that Elena had pulled from her own linen closet. There was a small table with a lamp, a hook on the wall for hanging clothes, a door that locked from the inside with a deadbolt that Elena had installed herself. Alessandro looked around the space with an expression she couldn't read. This is more than I expected. This is basic decency. My grandmother would haunt me if I let someone sleep on the street when I had a warm room going unused. Elena pointed to a door in the corner. That goes to the kitchen. You can use the sink and the bathroom there. I start baking at 3 in the morning, so you will hear me moving around, but I will not bother you. She turned to leave, then stopped. One rule, whatever you are running from, whatever business you have out there, it does not come into my bakery. You do not bring trouble through my door. You do not bring people who might bring trouble. This place is safe, and it stays safe. We have a deal? Alessandro met her eyes. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something that looked like respect. We have a deal. Elena nodded and left him alone in the storage room, that was now his home. 3 months later, Elena discovered something about Alessandro that she had suspected from the beginning, but had never confirmed. He was not just smart, he was brilliant, genuinely, frighteningly intelligent, the kind of mind that absorbed information like a sponge and reassembled it into patterns nobody else could see. She discovered this when she caught him fixing her accounting. She had been looking for a particular invoice, one of the dozens of papers that accumulated in the chaotic pile she kept in a basket behind the counter. And she had gone into the storage room, thinking she might have left it on the small table there. What she found instead was Alessandro surrounded by her ledger books, covered in his neat handwriting. "I was not stealing." His voice was immediately defensive, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I just noticed the numbers were wrong. You are undercharging for the sourdough by at least $1.50 per loaf, which adds up to almost $2,000 a year in lost revenue. Your profit margin on the pastries is being eaten by the butter costs because you are buying retail instead of wholesale. And I found 3 vendors who would give you the same quality at 30% less. And your tax filings from last year have 3 errors that are going to flag an audit if you do not correct them before the deadline next month." Elena stood in the doorway, staring at the ledger book spread across the cot, at the pages of notes and calculations, at the evidence of work that must have taken him weeks. "Where did you learn this?" "Library. Free access to the financial section. Also some textbooks I found in a dumpster behind NYU. The business school throws out good materials when the editions change." Elena walked forward and picked up one of the ledgers. The corrections were precise, thorough, explained in careful notes that showed exactly what she had been doing wrong and how to fix it. The handwriting was small but clear, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who had taught himself to write properly long after childhood. She started laughing. Alessandro looked alarmed. "You are not angry? Angry?" Elena set down the ledger and shook her head. "I have been paying an accountant $200 a month to miss exactly these problems. He has a degree from a fancy school and an office on Fifth Avenue, and he has been bleeding me dry for 6 years. You figured all of this out in 3 days living in my storage room." She met his eyes. "You are wasted sleeping on a cot and eating my leftovers." Alessandro's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. "I do not have papers. I do not have a degree. I do not have anything that would let me work legitimately. You have a brain that works better than anyone I have ever met." Elena crossed her arms. "You know what my husband used to say before he died? He used to say the bakery would never grow because I was too good at baking and too terrible at business. He was right. I make excellent bread. I cannot balance a checkbook to save my life." She pointed at the ledgers. "You can do what I cannot do. That makes you valuable. That makes you worth investing in." Alessandro stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I want to hire you. Not as a baker, God knows you would burn everything. As my business manager. Part-time, off the books at first while we figure out your situation. Room, board, and 20% of whatever profits you help me increase." She held out her hand. "Deal?" Alessandro looked at her hand for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but she could see him thinking, calculating, weighing the offer against whatever else he had waiting for him out there in the city. Then, slowly, he reached out and shook it. Deal. Elena had never regretted that handshake. Not once. Not even when she learned what Alessandro was becoming in the hours he spent away from the bakery. Not even when the newspapers started printing stories about the Moretti family and their young new enforcer with the brilliant mind and the cold eyes. She had made her choice. She stood by it. And somehow, despite everything, it worked. 5 years passed. The bakery tripled in size under Alessandro's management. Elena bought the building next door when it came up for sale, a decision Alessandro had pushed for after running projections that showed exactly how much revenue they were losing by turning away customers during the breakfast rush. They knocked out the wall between the two buildings, added proper seating for 50 people, expanded the kitchen to include new ovens that could produce 3 times the volume of bread. She hired 2 assistants for the baking side, young women from the neighborhood who reminded her of herself at their age. And she let Alessandro handle everything else: supplies, vendors, marketing, the website he built from scratch, the relationships with restaurants and grocery chains who wanted her bread on their shelves. The bakery that had been her grandmother's dream became something larger, something that employed 12 people and served hundreds of customers every day. Something that was known across Brooklyn and beyond as the place to get authentic Italian bread made the old way. Elena knew that Alessandro had other business. She was not blind and she was not stupid, and she had lived in Brooklyn long enough to recognize the signs. The phone calls he took in private, walking out to the alley where the dumpsters sat, and speaking in low, rapid Italian that she could not quite follow. The meetings that left him looking older and harder than a man his age should look, the tension in his shoulders when he returned from wherever he had been. The black car that sometimes waited for him at the corner, driven by men who never came inside and never made eye contact with anyone who passed. She knew he was building something beyond the bakery, something that operated in shadows she was wise enough not to examine too closely. She knew in the abstract way that people in Brooklyn knew such things, that Alessandro Moretti had become someone important in a world that operated by different rules than the ones she lived by. But he never brought that world into her shop, never let it touch her or her employees or her customers. There was a line between his two lives, and he honored it absolutely, keeping the bakery clean and safe and separate from whatever else he did. In return, Elena never asked questions. It was a strange arrangement, but it worked. "You're still sleeping in the storage room," Elena said one morning, watching him review invoices at the small desk he had claimed as his own. The morning rush had ended and the bakery was quiet, sunlight streaming through the windows and catching the flour dust that always seemed to float in the air. Alessandro did not look up from his papers. "I am." "You could afford an apartment now. A nice one. I know what I am paying you, and I know you have other income." "I could, but you do not." "No. Why not?" He set down his pen and turned to face her. For a moment, the mask he wore slipped, and she saw the boy he had been when he first walked through her door. Hungry, wary, waiting for the world to confirm what it had taught him about trust and kindness and whether they could be real. "Because this is home," he said. "The first real home I have ever had. The first place where someone let me in without wanting something from me. The first place where I did not have to watch my back every second." He paused, and she saw something painful move behind his eyes. "I am not ready to leave. I do not know if I ever will be." Elena felt something crack in her chest, a hairline fracture in the carefully maintained distance she had kept between them. She had been careful not to love him like a son, not to need him like family, because she knew what he was becoming, and she knew that people in his world did not live long. But he was making that distance very hard to maintain. "You know you do not owe me anything," she said quietly. "The help I gave you back then, that was not a debt to be repaid. That was just basic decency. That was what any human being should do for another." Alessandro stood and walked toward her. At 25, he had filled out, the gauntness replaced by lean muscle, the wariness transformed into something more controlled. He looked dangerous now, in a way he had not before, a predator who had learned to wear the skin of something tame. But when he looked at Elena, none of that showed. When he looked at Elena, he was still just the hungry boy she had fed 5 years ago on a cold October morning. "I know it was not a debt," he said. "That is exactly why I am still here, because you never asked for anything, because you never wanted anything from me except what I chose to give, because you looked at a homeless kid with nothing to offer, and you saw someone worth helping." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick with papers. "This is not repayment," he continued, setting it on the counter between them. "This is a gift. The deed to this building, plus the 4 buildings on either side. I bought them last year through a holding company. They are yours now, free and clear. No one will ever be able to threaten your bakery again. No developer, no landlord, no one." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Alessandro held up a hand. "Before you say anything, let me finish. I know what you are going to say. It is too much. You cannot accept it. I do not need to do this." He smiled, and for once it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made him look his age instead of older. "But I want to do this. Not because I owe you, but because giving you security makes me happy. Because making sure you are safe is the only way I know how to say thank you for 5 years of being treated like a human being when the rest of the world treated me like garbage." Elena looked at the envelope. 5 buildings. Even in this neighborhood, that was worth millions of dollars. More money than her grandmother had ever imagined. More security than 3 generations of Mitchell women had ever known. Then she looked at Alessandro. Then she did what she had wanted to do since the first day she met him. She pulled him into a hug. He went stiff for a moment, surprised by the contact. Then his arms came around her and she felt him shaking slightly, a tremor that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with need. "You stupid boy," she muttered against his shoulder. "I told you, basic decency. That is all it ever was." "No!" Alessandro's voice was rough, thick with something he was fighting to control. That was everything. That was the whole world. They stood there for a long moment, the baker and the boy she had fed, holding on to each other in the morning light of a bakery that smelled like bread and flour and home. 10 years after that first morning, Elena retired. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her joints ached more than they used to, the price of decades spent kneading dough and standing on concrete floors. Her hands, shaped by countless loaves, had started to betray her with stiffness and pain. She had trained her successor, a young woman named Maria, who had the same instinct for bread that Elena had inherited from her grandmother. The same feel for when the dough was right and when it needed more time. The bakery would survive without her. It would continue to serve the neighborhood, continue to carry her grandmother's name, continue to be the place where people came for good bread and kind words. She had done her work. She had earned her rest. Alessandro had survived without her too, though she had not expected that part. He was someone important now, someone whose name appeared in newspapers in ways that made her deliberately not read the articles. He had empires, plural, legitimate businesses layered over the other kind like frosting on a cake. Men feared him. Men died because of him, or because of the orders he gave, or because they had made the mistake of crossing the family he now led. She knew that in the abstract way she knew many things she chose not to examine too closely. She had made her peace with who he was, because she remembered who he had been, and because she believed that the kindness she had shown him still lived somewhere in his heart, even if it was buried under years of hard choices. But he still came to the bakery every Sunday morning, still sat at the small table in the corner where he had eaten his first meal all those years ago, still ordered coffee and croissants and spent an hour talking with Elena about nothing important. The weather, the neighborhood gossip, the grandchildren of regular customers whose names she was starting to forget. He never missed a Sunday, not once in 10 years. Not when business took him to other cities. Not when enemies threatened him with violence. Not when the weight of his empire pressed down on his shoulders and made him look older than his 30 years. Sunday mornings at Mitchell's bakery were sacred. Everyone who worked for him knew that. Everyone who wanted to reach him knew to wait until afternoon. The last Sunday before she left for the retirement community in Florida, Alessandro arrived with a gift. "I know you said no more gifts." He set the small velvet box on the table between them, next to the untouched croissant and the coffee that was still steaming. "But this one is different. It belonged to my mother." Elena opened the box and found a necklace. Simple gold, a small pendant in the shape of a crescent moon. It was beautiful in the way that old jewelry is beautiful, worn smooth by years of handling, carrying the weight of memories she would never know. "She gave it to me before she died." Alessandro's voice was steady, but Elena had known him too long to miss the undercurrent. "She said it would protect me. I have kept it all these years, carried it with me through everything, but I think it should go to someone who actually deserves protection." Elena looked at the necklace. Then she looked at Alessandro. "I am not your mother." "No!" Alessandro's smile was sad and soft, the smile of someone saying goodbye to something he wasn't ready to let go. "But you are the closest thing I have had." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back because she was not the kind of woman who cried, even when she should, even when the moment demanded it. "You are going to be okay," she said. "Even after I am gone, you are going to be okay." Alessandro reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, the hands of a man who had built and destroyed and protected, the hands of someone who had learned to survive in a world that showed no mercy. "I am going to be okay because of you, because you taught me that kindness exists, because you showed me that not everyone wants something in return, because you looked at me when I was nothing and you treated me like I was someone." He squeezed gently. "I was a monster in training when I walked through your door. I was already becoming what this world wanted to make me. But you saw something else. You treated me like I could be something better. And because of that, part of me always tried to be." He released her hand and leaned back in his chair. "I am not a good man, Elena. I have done things that would horrify you if I told you the details. I have made choices that I cannot undo, and would not take back even if I could. But I am better than I would have been. And that difference, that margin between what I could have become and what I actually became, that margin is you. Elena put on the necklace. The gold was warm against her skin, carrying the weight of a mother's love and a son's gratitude. That margin is enough, she said quietly. That margin is everything. Elena Mitchell lived another 12 years in that Florida retirement community. She made friends among the other residents, women her age who had their own stories of struggle and survival and small victories against long odds. She learned to play bridge poorly at first and then competently, spending her afternoons in games that stretched for hours and ended with laughter. She discovered a talent for watercolor painting that she had never suspected, filling canvas after canvas with images of Brooklyn bakeries and Italian coastlines, and a young man with dark eyes who she painted from memory. She was happy in the quiet way that people are happy when they have done their work and earned their rest. Alessandro visited twice a year, arriving in expensive cars with men who waited outside while he sat with her in the common room, bringing news from Brooklyn and pastries from the bakery that still carried her name. Sometimes they talked about the neighborhood, the changes that kept coming whether anyone wanted them or not. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had said everything that needed saying and could simply be together. Sometimes Alessandro looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and Elena would take his hand and hold it without asking questions, offering the same wordless comfort she had offered him all those years ago. When she died at 87, peacefully in her sleep on a warm Florida night, there were flowers waiting in her room that had arrived the hour before. White roses, dozens of them, filling the space with fragrance that reminded her of weddings and funerals, and all the moments in between that made up a life. The card read simply, "Thank you. For everything. Forever." The funeral was small. Old customers who had driven down from Brooklyn, distant relatives she barely knew, the few friends she had made in Florida, and in the back standing alone, a man in a dark suit with eyes that carried the weight of everything he had done and everything he had become. Alessandro did not speak to anyone. He did not approach the casket or join the receiving line or accept the condolences that people tried to offer. He just stood there remembering until everyone else had gone. Then he walked forward and placed something on her grave. A photograph, worn soft from years of handling. A young man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, standing at a bakery counter, and a woman with flour in her hair, handing him a plate of food. The first gift she ever gave him. The one he had never stopped being grateful for. He stood there for a long time, looking at the grave, at the flowers, at the simple headstone that bore her name, and the dates that marked the boundaries of her life. Then he spoke quietly, words meant only for her. "I kept my promise. The bakery is still standing. Maria is running it now, and she is doing well. The buildings are safe. The neighborhood remembers you." He paused, his voice catching. "I remember you, every day. Every choice I make, I ask myself what you would think, and sometimes that makes me better than I would be otherwise." He touched the headstone, his fingers tracing the letters of her name. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for feeding me. Thank you for letting me sleep in your storage room and work in your bakery and pretend I was a normal person instead of what I really was." He straightened his jacket and took a step back. "I will see you again someday. Until then, save me a croissant." He walked away into the Florida sunshine, leaving behind the woman who had changed his life with nothing more than a plate of food and a room with a lock on the inside. That was the whole story. A hungry boy and a baker who fed him. A kindness offered without expectation. A debt repaid not because it was owed, but because it was felt. The world is full of people who need feeding. Some of them will become powerful. Some of them will become dangerous. Some of them will remember the hands that helped them when they had nothing. And they will spend the rest of their lives trying to be worthy of that help. Elena Mitchell never knew in those final years just how much her kindness had shaped the man Alessandro became. She never knew about the enemies he spared, because they reminded him of the mercy she had shown. She never knew about the organizations he built that fed homeless youth in 5 cities, operated quietly through foundations that bore no name anyone would recognize. She never knew that the margin she had created, the difference between the monster he could have been and the man he actually was, had saved hundreds of lives she would never meet. But she knew enough. She knew that she had fed a hungry boy. She knew that he had never forgotten. She knew that kindness, offered freely and without calculation, had the power to change everything. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole world, contained in a plate of food in a room with a lock, and a woman who believed that every person deserved to be treated like a human being. Even the ones who had forgotten, especially the ones who had forgotten. Because sometimes that's all it takes to remind them. One meal, one kindness. One person who sees you when everyone else looks through you. Elena Mitchell understood that. And now perhaps so do you. The bakery is still there. The bread is still good. And somewhere in the margin between what we could become and what we actually are, there is room for everyone who chooses to be better. All it takes is someone willing to feed a stranger. All it takes is basic decency. All it takes is believing that kindness matters even when the world suggests otherwise. Elena believed that. Alessandro learned it from her, and the story continues. One meal at a time, one kindness at a time, one life changed at a time. Forever. Years after Elena's death, a journalist tried to write a story about Alessandro Moretti. She spent months researching, following the threads of his empire, documenting the businesses and the holdings, and the rumored connections to activities that never quite made it into court records. She thought she understood him. A self-made power broker, a man who had risen from nothing to control empires through intelligence and ruthlessness. But then she found the bakery. Mitchell's Bakery, still operating in Brooklyn, still serving the same bread from the same recipes, still run by a woman named Maria, who had flour in her hair and a smile for every customer. The journalist went there expecting to find a front, a money laundering operation, some piece of the criminal puzzle she was assembling. Instead, she found photographs on the wall. A young man, gaunt and hungry, standing at a counter. An older woman with kind eyes handing him food. Decades of pictures showing the same two people, aging together, the young man filling out and the woman growing silver-haired, but always with the same warmth between them. "Who is this?" the journalist asked, pointing at the photographs. Maria smiled, the way people smile when remembering someone they loved. "That was Elena Mitchell. She owned this bakery before me. And that," she pointed at the young man in the earliest photograph, "was the boy she fed when he had nothing. He helped her build this place into what it is today." "What happened to him?" Maria's smile faded slightly. "He became someone important, someone powerful, someone who did things I don't ask about." She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "But he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what she did for him. Every Sunday until she moved away, he came here for coffee and croissants. Every holiday, he sent flowers. Every year on her birthday, there was a donation to the food bank in her name." She looked at the journalist with eyes that held a challenge. "Whatever else he is, whatever else he's done, he's also the man who makes sure no child in this neighborhood goes hungry. He's the man who funds the shelters and the soup kitchens and the programs that help people like he used to be." The journalist put away her notebook. "Why are you telling me this?" Because you're trying to write a story about him, and you should know the whole truth. He's not a good man. I know that. Everyone knows that. But he's not just what the newspapers say either. He's complicated. He's human. He's someone who was helped when he had nothing, and he's spent his whole life trying to pass that help along." Maria turned back to her ovens, her voice floating over her shoulder. "Maybe that's worth writing about. Maybe that's the story people need to hear." The journalist never published her article. She couldn't figure out how to reconcile the monster she had expected to find with the man who funded homeless shelters and visited bakeries and kept photographs of an old woman who had once fed him breakfast. So she did something else instead. She volunteered at one of the food banks that bore no name, one of the programs that fed hungry people without asking where the money came from. She spent her weekends serving meals to children who reminded her of the young man in those photographs, gaunt and wary and waiting for the world to prove what it had already taught them about trust. And sometimes late at night she thought about Elena Mitchell, who had changed the world without knowing it, simply by offering a plate of food to a stranger. That was the real story. Not the empires or the rumors or the darkness that people whispered about, but the light that one small kindness could create, spreading outward through decades, touching lives that would never know where it came from. Elena Mitchell understood that light. She had spent her whole life carrying it, and when she passed it to Alessandro, he carried it too in his own complicated way, through all the shadows and all the choices and all the years that followed. The bakery still stands. The bread still rises, the story still continues. And somewhere in a kitchen that smells like flour and hope, someone is feeding a stranger. Because that's what Elena would have wanted. Because that's what kindness does. Because that's the only story that matters in the end. One meal at a time. One life at a time. Forever.